The 15th of November 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. In a supply depot 6 kilometers behind what Allied command believed was a quiet sector of the front line, steam rose from industrial-sized cooking pots as Corporal James Harrison stirred a vat of potato soup that would feed 200 men. The 28-year-old from Mississippi had joined the army to escape sharecropping, only to find himself wielding a ladle instead of a rifle. Outside, frost crystallized on the canvas of supply tents, while trucks rumbled past carrying ammunition to forward positions. Harrison checked his watch, 1400 hours, and wondered if the convoy scheduled to pick up hot meals would arrive on time. He had no way of knowing that in less than 3 hours, those same roads would carry an entirely different kind of traffic, and his kitchen utensils would become the most unlikely weapons in the European theater. The men at the depot joked that Harrison's biggest battles were against lumpy gravy and undercooked beans. They would soon discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption was. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one man, armed with nothing but cast iron and determination, would rewrite every assumption about courage, capability, and the supposed safety of rear echelon positions during the largest offensive of 1944. Corporal James Harrison had not touched a combat rifle since basic training 8 months earlier. His military occupational specialty listed him as cook, and in the rigidly segregated United States Army of 1944, that designation carried additional weight. The 523rd Quartermaster Service Company was an all-black unit assigned to supply operations, deliberately kept away from combat roles despite repeated requests from many of its members for transfer to fighting units. Harrison supervised a kitchen crew of 7 men, operating out of a converted barn that now housed 3 wood-burning stoves, shelving units filled with canned goods, and enough flour to bake bread for a battalion. The depot itself sprawled across a Belgian farm that had been requisitioned in September. 12 buildings, barns, storage sheds, and 1 farmhouse that served as administrative headquarters contained everything from engine parts to medical supplies. Approximately 40 men worked there at any given time, mostly from service companies like Harrison's. The tactical maps showed them well behind the lines in a sector where activity had been minimal for weeks. Intelligence reports indicated the enemy was too depleted to mount significant operations. The forests were quiet, except for routine patrols. Harrison had learned not to complain about his assignment. In Mississippi, he had picked cotton for a landowner who paid $3 per 100 pounds. The army paid him $78 per month, provided 3 meals daily, and had taught him culinary techniques he never imagined existed. He sent $40 home to his mother every month and saved the rest. After the war, he planned to open a restaurant in Memphis. He had the recipes worked out in a notebook he kept in his footlocker: fried chicken with a buttermilk brine, cornbread with actual butter, greens cooked slow with ham hock. His mother had taught him to cook when he was 8 years old, standing on a wooden crate to reach the stove in their 3-room sharecropper's cabin. She had shown him how to make something good from almost nothing, how to stretch a chicken to feed 6 people, how to turn beans and fat back into a meal that filled the stomach and lifted the spirit. Those early lessons had given Harrison an understanding of cooking as both craft and necessity, a skill that could mean the difference between mere survival and actual sustenance. The army had refined those skills, teaching him about sanitation, nutrition, and cooking at scale. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged: take what you have and make it better than anyone expects. That afternoon, as November light faded early under heavy clouds, Harrison's crew prepared the evening meal. Private Marcus Webb, a 19-year-old from Detroit, peeled potatoes with mechanical efficiency while humming Duke Ellington. Webb had factory experience before the army, working assembly lines at the Ford plant where his father had labored for 20 years. He brought that same assembly line mentality to kitchen work: efficient, consistent, no wasted motion. Corporal Samuel Price, the assistant cook from Philadelphia, monitored the bread baking in the ovens, periodically checking the internal temperature with a practiced hand. Price had worked in a bakery before the war, and his expertise with bread had made him invaluable to the kitchen operation. The 2 men formed Harrison's core team, supplemented by rotating duty personnel from other units who helped with basic prep work and cleanup. The menu was standard: potato soup, beef stew using canned meat, fresh bread, canned peaches for dessert. Nothing fancy, but Harrison took pride in making it taste better than regulation required. He had learned early in his army service that good food affected morale in ways that officers often failed to appreciate. Men who ate well complained less, worked harder, and maintained better discipline. Harrison had seen this principle proven repeatedly over 8 months of feeding service company personnel. The cooks were often the last people officers considered when thinking about unit effectiveness, but Harrison knew better. A cook who took pride in his work could improve an entire company's performance simply by making sure the food was hot, properly seasoned, and served with a degree of care that suggested someone actually cared about the men eating it. The kitchen generated enormous heat, despite the cold outside. Harrison had removed his field jacket, working in his olive-drab shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. A white apron, stained with the evidence of the day's work, covered his front. His tools hung within easy reach: cast-iron skillets of various sizes, heavy cooking spoons, meat tenderizers, carving knives with 8-inch blades, and his prized possession, a 14-inch chef's knife he had traded 2 cartons of cigarettes for in a supply depot outside Paris. That knife had come from a French restaurant that had been damaged during the liberation of Paris in August. The restaurant's owner, grateful to American forces, had given various items to soldiers as gifts. The chef's knife, proper French steel with excellent balance and an edge that held sharp through hundreds of cutting tasks, had ended up in the possession of a supply sergeant who neither cooked nor appreciated its quality. Harrison had spotted it being used to open crates and immediately recognized its value. The 2 cartons of cigarettes represented nearly a week's worth of his tobacco ration, but Harrison did not smoke. The trade was simple: cigarettes the sergeant wanted for a tool Harrison could actually use. The knife had become Harrison's constant companion in the kitchen, used for everything from butchering canned meat to chopping vegetables with surgical precision. At 1600 hours, the first irregularity occurred. Lieutenant Morrison, the white officer who commanded the depot, emerged from the headquarters building and walked quickly toward the motor pool instead of toward the mess for his usual afternoon coffee. Harrison noticed because Morrison was a creature of rigid habit. The lieutenant arrived at the mess at precisely 1600 hours every day, drank 1 cup of coffee with 2 sugars, reviewed the evening's menu, made some minor complaint that Harrison would politely acknowledge, and departed by 1615. The routine deviated perhaps 3 times in the 2 months Harrison had worked under him. Through the kitchen's open door, Harrison watched Morrison speaking urgently with Sergeant Davis, who managed the vehicle maintenance section. Both men kept glancing eastward, toward the forest. Harrison stepped outside, wiping his hands on his apron. The temperature had dropped noticeably in the past hour. His breath formed clouds in the air. He walked toward the motor pool, where several mechanics had stopped working to listen to Morrison and Davis. The scene was unusual enough that Harrison felt a prickling of unease along his spine, an instinct honed by 28 years of learning to read situations carefully. Morrison's voice carried across the frozen ground. The lieutenant was saying something about radio reports, about communications being disrupted with forward positions, about trying to reach division headquarters for clarification. The words were fragmented, but Harrison caught enough to understand that something had changed in the supposedly quiet sector. Then they heard it. A low rumble from the east, like distant thunder, except the sky showed no storm clouds. The sound was continuous, rolling across the forest in waves. Artillery, heavy artillery, more concentrated than anything they had heard in this sector before. The sound had a particular quality that Harrison recognized from training films and briefings: the deep, sustained percussion of massed guns firing in coordinated barrages. Morrison made a decision. He ordered Davis to prepare 3 trucks for immediate evacuation of essential supplies and personnel. The lieutenant's face had gone pale, his movements jerky with poorly concealed anxiety. He told Davis to prioritize ammunition and medical supplies, then disappeared back into headquarters to attempt radio contact with higher command. The rumbling continued, growing marginally louder. Harrison returned to his kitchen, where Webb and Price had also heard the distant percussion. The three men looked at each other without speaking for several seconds. Webb's hands had stopped moving, a half-peeled potato forgotten in his grip. Price had opened the oven to check the bread, but now stood frozen, listening to the ominous sound rolling across the landscape. Webb broke the silence. He asked if they should pack up the kitchen equipment. Harrison considered the question. Morrison had not included the kitchen in his evacuation priorities, and Harrison understood why. In the calculus of military logistics, cooking gear ranked far below ammunition and medicine. But the rumbling continued, and Harrison's instincts, honed by growing up in a place where reading situations correctly could mean the difference between safety and violence, told him something significant was happening. He told Webb and Price to continue preparing the evening meal. If they were evacuating, the men would need to eat first. If they were staying, the men would definitely need to eat. Either way, their job remained the same. For the next 90 minutes, the kitchen crew worked while the distant artillery continued its ominous percussion. Trucks moved through the depot, loading supplies under Morrison's increasingly frantic supervision. The lieutenant had made radio contact with a battalion headquarters 12 kilometers west, which confirmed that forward positions were reporting intense activity across a broad front. The situation remained unclear, but the word attack appeared in several transmissions. Harrison moved through his familiar routines, but his mind worked on a different level, processing the implications of what he was hearing and seeing. The artillery suggested a major operation, not a raid or limited probe. The disrupted communications indicated coordinated action designed to blind Allied command. The direction of the sounds, from the east, where the supposedly depleted forces had been assessed as incapable of major offensive action, suggested that intelligence estimates had been catastrophically wrong. He thought about the men in the depot, most of whom had never experienced actual combat. Supply clerks, mechanics, administrative personnel. They had weapons and basic training, but their daily reality consisted of paperwork, maintenance schedules, and inventory management. Morrison was a competent logistician, but had no combat command experience. If serious fighting reached the depot, the outcome would be determined less by training or leadership, and more by sheer luck and the quality of the opposition they faced. At 1745 hours, with full darkness settled over the frozen landscape, Harrison was ladling soup into serving containers when the character of the distant sound changed. The artillery thunder was now accompanied by something else, a higher-pitched whine that grew steadily louder. Vehicle engines. Many vehicle engines, moving fast on the roads that led through the forest toward the depot. Morrison ran from the headquarters building, shouting orders that contradicted his earlier evacuation plan. He now wanted everyone to grab weapons and prepare defensive positions. The depot had precisely 16 M1 Garand rifles in its small arms locker, intended for guard duty. 40 men, 16 rifles. The mathematics of that equation were unfavorable. Harrison watched mechanics and supply clerks scrambling to distribute the available weapons. Men argued over who should get the rifles, their voices tight with fear. Morrison tried to impose order, assigning weapons based on some logic that Harrison could not discern. Possibly seniority, possibly who Morrison trusted most, possibly just whoever grabbed them first. The scene had a quality of barely controlled chaos that suggested how unprepared the depot was for actual combat. Harrison and his kitchen crew were not included in the distribution. The cooking staff, as always, rated last priority for combat equipment. Harrison felt a familiar frustration rise in his chest, the same frustration that had accompanied him throughout his army service, the constant message that he and men who looked like him were good enough to cook and clean but not trusted with the real work of soldiering. The frustration was not new. Harrison had felt it at Camp Shelby during basic training, when black recruits had been segregated into separate barracks and training companies, given inferior equipment, and assigned to black officers only at the lowest ranks. He had felt it when his repeated requests for infantry training had been denied without explanation. He had felt it every time a white soldier with less education and fewer skills was promoted, while Harrison remained a corporal despite obvious competence in every task assigned to him. The engine sounds grew louder. Through the darkness, headlights appeared on the eastern road, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Morrison, standing near the headquarters building with binoculars, tried to identify the convoy. For a moment, hope flickered. Perhaps these were American units falling back in good order, executing a planned withdrawal. Then Morrison lowered the binoculars, and Harrison saw the lieutenant's face in the light spilling from the headquarters window. Morrison's expression answered the question before he spoke the words. The lieutenant shouted that they were vehicles from the opposing side, moving directly toward the depot. He estimated 5 to 7 trucks, possibly more, behind them. He ordered everyone to defensive positions, to use the buildings for cover, to hold fire until the vehicles were in optimal range. Harrison stood in the kitchen doorway, watching mechanics and clerks scatter to positions around the depot's perimeter. Many had never fired their weapons outside of basic training. Several forgot to chamber rounds in their panic. Morrison tried to establish fields of fire to coordinate defensive sectors, but his commands were confused and contradictory. The lieutenant was improvising with no clear plan, reacting to a situation that had evolved far beyond his training or experience. Harrison observed this chaos with a strange detachment, his mind working through a problem that had no good solution. 40 men with 16 rifles against an unknown number of experienced soldiers with full combat equipment. The depot had no fortifications, no prepared fighting positions, no heavy weapons. The buildings were wood and canvas, offering concealment but minimal protection against military firearms. The best tactical option would have been evacuation hours ago, but Morrison had hesitated too long, and now the enemy vehicles blocked the western escape route. The vehicles, 6 trucks and 2 smaller scout cars, as Harrison could now distinguish in their headlights, roared into the depot's central area and stopped in a formation that blocked the western exit road. Doors flew open. Soldiers poured out, at least 30 men, possibly more. They moved with the efficiency of experienced troops who had executed this type of operation many times before. Their deployment was textbook: immediate security perimeter, fire teams covering likely defensive positions, command element establishing control. Morrison fired first, his shot wild and high, driven by panic rather than aim. The response was instant and overwhelming. Automatic weapons tore through the night, bullets punching through wooden walls, ricochets whining off metal equipment. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out Morrison's attempts to maintain command. The brief American resistance collapsed within 90 seconds. 2 mechanics fell wounded. Harrison could not tell how seriously in the chaos and darkness. The others, recognizing the impossibility of their situation, raised their hands in surrender. Harrison, still standing in the kitchen doorway, watched soldiers moving through the depot with tactical precision. They shouted commands, herding the American personnel into the open area near the headquarters building. An officer, identifiable by his different insignia and the way others deferred to him, issued rapid orders. Soldiers began searching buildings, securing the perimeter, establishing control. The entire operation demonstrated professional military competence that the depot's improvised defense could never have matched. Harrison made a decision. He stepped back into his kitchen, moving away from the doorway into the deeper shadows near the stoves. Webb and Price looked at him with wide eyes, waiting for direction. Harrison put a finger to his lips, signaling silence, then pointed toward the storage room at the kitchen's rear, a space filled with flour sacks, canned goods, and a small door that opened into a root cellar beneath the building. The 3 men moved quietly into the storage room, just as they heard voices outside the kitchen. Harrison eased the storage room door closed, leaving it open just a crack to see and hear what happened next. Through that narrow opening, he watched 2 soldiers enter the kitchen, weapons ready, sweeping the space for occupants. They called out, receiving no response. One soldier noticed the still warm stoves, the pots of soup and stew prepared for a meal that would now never be served. He said something to his companion that made both men laugh. Harrison did not understand the language, but the soldier's gesture toward the food and then toward his mouth made the meaning clear enough. The soldiers left to report the kitchen clear but well stocked with food. Harrison heard more voices outside, more movement through the depot. The systematic search continued for approximately 20 minutes. Through the crack in the door, Harrison watched several more soldiers enter the kitchen, this time accompanied by the officer. The officer examined the cooking equipment, the supplies, the prepared food. He issued orders that Harrison could not understand but could interpret from context. The forces were claiming the kitchen for their own use. This made tactical sense. The depot offered shelter, supplies, and a strategic position. They had clearly seized it not for destruction but for occupation, at least temporarily. They would need to feed their troops, and here was a functioning kitchen with food already prepared. What happened next would be debated in Harrison's memory for the rest of his life, analyzed from every angle during countless sleepless nights. Some might call it recklessness. Others might call it courage. Harrison himself never found a word that captured the complex calculation that occurred in approximately 15 seconds as he crouched in that storage room, listening to soldiers claim his kitchen. The calculation included these factors. 40 American soldiers held at gunpoint in the central yard, including men Harrison had cooked for every day for 2 months. The approaching winter night with temperatures forecast to drop below freezing. The wounded mechanics who would need medical attention soon. The officer's reasonable assumption that the depot was now secured and posed no further threat. And perhaps most significantly, a factor that Harrison barely admitted to himself, the accumulated weight of 8 months being told he was not soldier material, 8 months wielding spoons instead of weapons, 8 months of sideways glances and casual dismissals from men who assumed his skin color determined his capabilities. Harrison thought about his father, who had died when Harrison was 12, working another man's land for pennies. He thought about his mother, who had cleaned white people's houses for 30 years and never complained. He thought about every time someone had looked at him and seen only what they expected to see, never bothering to discover what else might be there. He thought about Webb, 19 years old, with dreams of becoming an engineer after the war, stuck peeling potatoes because the army would not train black men for technical positions. He thought about Price, who had wanted to be a baker with his own shop, relegated to military kitchens because that was the only culinary role available to him. Harrison turned to Webb and Price in the darkness of the storage room. He whispered that he needed them to stay hidden, to stay silent, to wait for an opportunity to escape toward the American lines to the west. Both men started to protest, but Harrison cut them off. He told them this was not a debate. He told them that someone needed to get word back about what had happened, about the force that had taken the depot, about the broader offensive that was clearly underway, and he told them, though he did not explain why he believed it, that he needed to do something about the soldiers who had taken his kitchen. Then Harrison did something that seemed insane by any rational military calculation. He picked up his 14-inch chef's knife from where it hung on the storage room wall, tested its edge with his thumb, found it satisfactorily sharp, and stepped back into the kitchen. The kitchen was momentarily empty, the soldiers having left to attend to other duties. Harrison moved to the position he knew best, behind the serving counter, where he had stood countless times ladling food onto trays. He could hear voices outside, commands being shouted, the sounds of his fellow Americans being organized into some kind of order. Harrison's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth tasted of copper and fear. But his hands were steady as he arranged his tools within easy reach. The cast-iron skillets, ranging from 8 to 15 inches in diameter, hung on hooks he had installed himself. Each skillet had specific purposes, the 8-inch for eggs and small portions, the 10-inch for general use, the 12-inch for larger quantities, the 15-inch monster that weighed nearly 8 pounds for tasks requiring serious heat retention and mass. He knew each pan's weight, balance point, and striking capability from hundreds of hours of use. The meat tenderizer, normally used to pound tough cuts into submission, had a flat head with a textured surface and weighed approximately 2 pounds. The long cooking spoons had solid wooden handles that could serve as short clubs. The carving knives, kept sharp for processing meat, could cut through muscle and sinew. And his chef's knife, that prized French steel, had an edge that could slice paper-thin vegetable ribbons or cut through bone with equal efficiency. Harrison had no combat training beyond basic infantry instruction. He had never studied hand-to-hand fighting techniques. He had certainly never contemplated using kitchen equipment as weapons, but he had spent 8 months developing an intimate familiarity with these tools, understanding their weight distribution and mechanical properties through constant use. He knew in a way that transcended conscious thought exactly how each implement would move through space when swung with force. The first soldier who entered alone was a young man, perhaps 20 years old, who had been ordered to bring food samples to the officer for inspection. He carried an empty mess kit and wore an expression of someone grateful to be given a task that involved warm food rather than standing guard in the freezing darkness. The soldier saw Harrison standing behind the counter and stopped, surprise registering on his face. His rifle hung on his shoulder, not immediately accessible. For a long moment, neither man moved. Harrison could see the young soldier's face clearly in the lamplight, smooth features not yet hardened by years of combat, eyes that widened with confusion as he tried to process what he was seeing. Harrison spoke in English, his voice remarkably calm considering his heart rate had probably doubled. "Put down your weapon and raise your hands." The young soldier did not understand the words, but he understood tone and gesture when Harrison pointed the chef's knife at him and then at the floor. The soldier's eyes moved from Harrison's face to the large knife in Harrison's hand, then back to Harrison's face. Harrison saw the calculation happening behind those eyes, the distance to his rifle, the speed required to unsling it and bring it to bear, the question of whether this American cook posed a real threat or could be easily subdued. The soldier made his decision. His hand moved toward his rifle, fingers reaching for the strap. Harrison had anticipated this response. He had worked out, in the few seconds before the soldier entered, exactly what he would do if compliance was not immediate. The soldier's movement toward his weapon triggered Harrison's prepared response. Harrison moved faster than the soldier expected. 28 years of picking cotton from before sunrise to after sunset had built a wiry strength in his frame that was easy to underestimate. His lean build suggested weakness to people who did not understand that endurance and explosive power could coexist in bodies built by relentless physical labor. He lunged across the counter, swinging the cast-iron skillet that had been heating on the stove. The heavy pan, retaining thermal energy from the fire, connected with the soldier's jaw with a sound like a hammer striking wood. The young soldier's head snapped sideways from the impact. His knees buckled, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed without firing a shot, unconscious before he hit the floor. Harrison vaulted the counter, his heart now racing so fast he felt dizzy. He grabbed the soldier under the arms and dragged his body behind the counter, out of sight from the doorway. The soldier was still breathing. Harrison checked automatically, his hands finding a pulse at the neck, but deeply unconscious. Blood trickled from the corner of the soldier's mouth, where the skillet had broken skin against teeth. Harrison took the soldier's rifle, checked that it was loaded, then set it aside. The rifle would make noise. Noise would bring more soldiers than he could possibly handle. The sound of a gunshot would end whatever slim advantage surprise had given him. He needed to work silently to maintain the illusion of normalcy for as long as possible. He arranged the unconscious soldier's body so that it would not be immediately visible to someone entering the kitchen, positioning him behind a stack of flour sacks. Then Harrison returned to his position behind the counter, resuming his stance as though nothing had occurred. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the chef's knife, but his breathing had steadied. He had crossed a threshold. Whatever happened next, there was no retreat from the course he had chosen. What happened over the next 37 minutes? Harrison would later check his watch obsessively, trying to reconstruct the timeline, could only be described as a masterclass in improvised combat using completely unsuitable equipment, executed by someone with no formal training but significant motivation and home field advantage. The second soldier entered the kitchen 8 minutes later, also alone, also sent to investigate why the first soldier had not returned with the food samples. This one was older than the first, perhaps 30 years old, more cautious in his movements. His rifle was at ready position as he scanned the kitchen, his eyes sharp and alert. He saw Harrison standing near the stoves, apparently focused on stirring a pot of soup, looking every bit the harmless cook absorbed in his duties. The soldier barked something, probably in order to identify himself or explain where the first soldier had gone. Harrison did not understand the specific words, but he recognized the tone of command, the expectation of compliance. He responded in English with words he knew would not be understood, buying 2 seconds of confusion. "Sorry. Friend, I don't speak your language. Come here and I'll show you where your buddy went." The soldier frowned, taking a step closer to the counter where Harrison stood. Harrison kept his movements slow and non-threatening, one hand stirring the soup pot with a long spoon, the other hand out of sight below the counter level. He gestured with the spoon toward the storage room, as though indicating where the first soldier might be found. The soldier took another step closer, beginning to lower his rifle slightly as the situation seemed less threatening than he had anticipated. Harrison waited until the soldier was within 3 paces of the counter, close enough that missing would be impossible, far enough that the rifle could not be brought to bear before Harrison could act. Then Harrison threw the pot of near-boiling soup directly into the soldier's face. The soldier's scream was immediate and agonized. Instinct made him drop his rifle and claw at his face, trying to wipe away the scalding liquid. Harrison dropped the empty pot and came around the counter with the meat tenderizer, moving with absolute commitment, because hesitation would give the soldier time to recover. The tenderizer, 2 pounds of dense metal on the end of a wooden handle, swung in an arc that terminated at the soldier's temple. The impact cut the scream short. The soldier collapsed, his hands still raised toward his burned face, now unconscious from the blow to his head. Harrison stood over him, breathing hard, the tenderizer still gripped in his hand, waiting to see if anyone had heard the brief scream. Seconds passed. 10 seconds. 20. No one came. The sounds from outside continued unchanged. Voices, movement, the routine noises of an occupied position. Either the scream had not carried far enough, or it had been dismissed as some unimportant noise among many. Harrison dragged the second soldier behind the counter to join the first. Both men were alive, their chests rising and falling with steady breaths, but both would remain unconscious for significant periods. The older soldier's face showed angry red burns from the soup, injuries that would require medical attention but were unlikely to prove fatal. Harrison leaned against the wall, his legs suddenly weak with the realization of what he had just done. He had attacked 2 soldiers. He had committed acts that would justify summary execution if he were captured. There was no path now except forward, no option to claim he had remained neutral in his kitchen while others fought. He had chosen his course, and that choice carried consequences he did not want to contemplate. But he also felt something else beneath the fear and shock, a grim satisfaction at having finally acted, at having demonstrated capability that no one had believed he possessed, at having used the skills available to him against opponents who had assumed their military training made them invulnerable to a cook with kitchen tools. Harrison returned to his position behind the counter and began to plan. 2 soldiers had entered the kitchen at intervals of 8 minutes. Others would come when these 2 failed to return. Harrison needed to establish a pattern to create the impression of normalcy that would allow him to continue operating before the situation became obvious. He moved to the kitchen's external door and placed several containers of prepared food just outside, arranging them to be visible to anyone approaching. Then he returned to his position, waiting for the next soldiers to arrive. The 3rd and 4th soldiers approached together approximately 9 minutes later. They had been sent to investigate why 2 soldiers and no food had emerged from the kitchen. These 2 were more professional in their approach, weapons ready, communicating with hand signals as they scanned the area before entering. They saw the food containers outside the door and exchanged comments that Harrison could not understand, but that seemed to involve some amusement at the American cook, who apparently was still performing his duties despite everything that had happened. Harrison, acting as though nothing were unusual, emerged from the kitchen door carrying another container of stew. He saw the 2 soldiers, showed no alarm and gestured at the food containers, and then back toward the kitchen, in what he hoped was universal language for, "There's plenty more inside if you want to help carry it." The 2 soldiers exchanged glances. One of them said something that made both laugh, apparently at the absurdity of the American cook, who seemed oblivious to his situation. The first soldier slung his rifle over his shoulder and moved to pick up a container of food. The second maintained his ready position, more cautious, his eyes scanning the area while his companion dealt with the heavy container. Harrison waited until the first soldier's hands were occupied with the container, then moved with an explosiveness that caught both men completely off guard. He swung the 15-inch cast-iron skillet, his largest, heaviest pan, in a horizontal arc that connected with the armed soldier's head. The impact produced a metallic thunk that Harrison felt reverberate through his arms. The soldier's knees buckled immediately, his rifle clattering to the frozen ground. The second soldier, burdened by the food container, tried to drop it and reach for his slung rifle simultaneously. Harrison closed the distance in 2 steps, driving the butt end of a heavy wooden cooking spoon into the soldier's solar plexus. The strike was precise, hitting the soft tissue below the ribcage where it would disrupt breathing and cause maximum pain without requiring lethal force. The soldier folded in half, gasping for air, the food container hitting the ground and spilling its contents across the frozen earth. Harrison finished both soldiers with additional strikes, the skillet against the second soldier's head as he tried to recover his breath. A second blow to the first soldier, who showed signs of regaining consciousness. Both men went still. Harrison dragged their bodies into the kitchen, each requiring multiple trips because of their weight and his exhaustion. 4 soldiers now lay unconscious behind his counter. 4 rifles were hidden with them, removed from the tactical equation. Harrison's shirt was soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. His arms ached from the impacts. The recoil of metal against bone transmitted through the cast iron into his joints. But he was standing, and 4 trained soldiers were not. And some part of his mind marveled at this impossible reality, even as he prepared for what came next. Harrison checked his watch. 26 minutes had elapsed since he had struck the first soldier. He knew his time was running short. The pattern of soldiers entering and not returning would soon become impossible to ignore. The officer would investigate, probably with overwhelming force. Harrison needed to maximize whatever time remained. He moved through the kitchen with deliberate purpose, arranging his environment to his advantage. He poured cooking grease onto the floor near the stove area, creating a slick surface that would be nearly invisible in the lamplight, but devastating to anyone moving fast. He positioned pot handles to extend from the stovetops at precise angles, creating obstacles that would catch legs or arms. He adjusted the oil lamps to cast the area behind the counter into deeper shadow, while keeping the entry points well lit. These preparations took 3 minutes. Harrison returned to his position and waited, the chef's knife in his right hand, a carving fork in his left, his body positioned for maximum advantage when the next soldiers arrived. They came 6 minutes later, 3 this time, sent as a group to determine why no one was returning from the kitchen. These 3 entered with weapons ready, clearly suspicious, their movements coordinated to cover multiple angles. Harrison could not rely on the element of surprise or the soldier's assumption of his harmlessness. These men knew something was wrong and had come prepared to address it. Harrison was kneeling behind the counter when they entered, apparently searching for something in the lower cabinets. He called out in English, his tone frustrated and distracted. "Hold on. Just trying to find the serving spoons. Someone keeps moving them." The 3 soldiers advanced cautiously into the kitchen, spreading out to maintain overlapping fields of fire. The first soldier stepped onto the greased floor and immediately lost his footing. His arms windmilled as he fought for balance, his rifle swinging wide. The second and third soldiers instinctively moved to help their companion, clustering together in a way that sacrificed their tactical advantage. Harrison exploded upward from behind the counter, his timing precise, his targets chosen. He threw a pot of scalding water, not boiling but hot enough to cause severe pain, in a wide arc that caught the 2 soldiers who had maintained their footing. Their reactions were instant. Screams, hands moving to faces, weapons dropping or pointing skyward as pain overwhelmed training. Harrison vaulted the counter for the 3rd time that evening, this time armed with his chef's knife in one hand and a carving fork in the other. He moved through the confused, pained, off-balance soldiers with a speed that his exhaustion should have made impossible. The chef's knife was used as a striking tool rather than a cutting implement. Its weight and handle made it effective for blunt force blows to temples and pressure points. The carving fork, with its 4 steel tines, served to control one soldier's weapon hand, while Harrison struck him with the knife. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 90 seconds. When it ended, 3 more soldiers lay unconscious on Harrison's kitchen floor, adding to the growing collection behind the counter. Harrison leaned against the wall, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and the after-effects of adrenaline. He checked his watch again. 31 minutes since the first strike, 7 soldiers neutralized, 7 rifles captured. The sounds from outside had changed. Harrison could hear more voices, more urgency in their tone. Orders were being shouted with a sharpness that suggested someone had noticed the pattern. An officer's voice cut through the other sounds, issuing commands with unmistakable authority. Harrison knew his impossible run was approaching its end. He had perhaps 5 more minutes before the situation became completely untenable. But in those 5 minutes, he decided, he would extract whatever additional cost he could impose on the forces that had taken the depot and threatened his fellow soldiers. He quickly repositioned the unconscious soldiers to create obstacles near the doorway, then moved to the kitchen's rear exit, the small door that led to the root cellar where Webb and Price remained hidden. He whispered urgent instructions through the door, outlining a desperate plan that would require perfect timing and absolute trust. Both men protested that the plan was suicidal. Harrison acknowledged this assessment and told them to prepare anyway. The next 4 soldiers came as a fire team, properly tactical, moving with professional coordination, clearly briefed that the kitchen represented a threat. They entered through the front door with weapons ready, scanning for targets, communicating with hand signals that showed extensive training. What they found appeared to be an empty kitchen with clear signs of struggle, overturned pots, water on the floor, grease stains, but no visible occupants. The team leader called out a command, probably ordering any occupants to reveal themselves. His soldiers advanced carefully, checking behind the counter where they found the pile of unconscious men. The team leader's sharp intake of breath and urgent call to his companions told Harrison everything he needed to know about how the discovery of 7 unconscious soldiers would be interpreted. The team oriented toward the storage room, weapons trained on the door, preparing to clear what they assumed was the final position. That was when Webb and Price, following Harrison's desperate plan, created noise in the root cellar beneath the storage room, banging on pipes, scraping metal against metal, making sounds that suggested multiple people in a defensive position below the kitchen. The fire team oriented toward this new threat vector, weapons pointing downward toward the floor where the sounds originated. Harrison came through the rear exit behind them, moving with the absolute commitment of someone who knew hesitation meant death. He struck the rearmost soldier first, a crushing blow from the cast-iron skillet to the base of the skull. The soldier dropped without sound. Harrison kept moving, his body operating on pure instinct and muscle memory, from 8 months of kitchen work that had taught him to move efficiently in confined spaces, to strike precisely when cutting meat, to coordinate hand and eye with the precision required for good cooking. The second soldier turned at the sound of his companion falling, bringing his weapon around. Harrison threw the heavy skillet like a discus, the 8 pounds of cast iron spinning through 3 feet of space, to strike the soldier's face with devastating impact. The soldier went down. Harrison closed with the remaining 2, the chef's knife in one hand, a meat cleaver in the other. His movements those of a man who had abandoned any concern for his own safety in favor of completing the task before him. The engagement was brutal and brief. 45 seconds from Harrison's emergence to the moment when the last soldier collapsed unconscious to the floor. Harrison stood among the bodies, gasping for air, blood from a cut on his forehead dripping into his left eye, his ribs screaming pain from where a rifle stock had connected during the struggle. 11 soldiers, 11 men who had entered his kitchen expecting food or simple investigation, and found instead a cook who refused to perform only the role others had assigned him. Harrison felt no pride in what he had done, only a grim awareness that he had proven something that should never have required proving, and that the cost of that proof might yet be his life. Webb and Price emerged from the root cellar, their faces showing shock at the scene before them. Harrison told them to return to hiding, that more would come, that this was far from over. Both men refused, saying they would not hide while Harrison fought alone. Harrison, too exhausted to argue, simply nodded and began positioning the captured rifles around the kitchen to suggest multiple defenders. The sounds from outside indicated that the situation had reached a critical point. The officer's voice was now sharp with anger and concern. Harrison could hear vehicles moving, equipment being repositioned, the sounds of a force preparing for a significant assault on a position that had unexpectedly proven problematic. Harrison arranged the 11 captured rifles in positions around the kitchen that would suggest at least 4 or 5 defenders. He positioned the unconscious soldiers' bodies to create barriers that would slow any assault. He placed the remaining pots of water on the stoves to boil, preparing every possible weapon and obstacle. Webb and Price, having committed to staying, helped with these preparations, their movements quick and efficient despite their obvious terror. Then Harrison took a position behind the heaviest overturned table, armed with the last unused skillet and his chef's knife, and waited for what he knew would be the final confrontation. The officer's voice called out in accented English, the first words Harrison had understood from the opposing force. "American soldiers in the kitchen building. You will surrender immediately, or we will destroy the building with you inside." Harrison's response surprised even himself with its steadiness. His voice projected across the frozen ground, with the authority of someone who had accepted whatever consequences would follow. "You got 11 of your boys in here. You start throwing explosives around, they'll be as finished as me." A long silence followed this declaration. Harrison could hear urgent conversation outside, multiple voices discussing options. The mathematics of the situation had shifted dramatically. 11 soldiers missing, potentially being held by unknown numbers of Americans in a fortified position. The cost of simply destroying the building had become unacceptable. The officer called out again, "How many are you?" Harrison chose his words carefully, maintaining the deception that had become his only remaining advantage. "Enough that you're going to want to think carefully about your next move. Your boys are unconscious but breathing. They stay that way if you're smart about this." More discussion outside, the voices more heated now. Harrison used the time to scan desperately for any additional resources he had overlooked. His eyes fell on the large flour sacks in the storage room, and a desperate possibility occurred to him. Flour dust, when dispersed in air and ignited, could create a significant explosion. He had heard about grain elevator explosions during his time in Mississippi. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it represented one more tool if the situation deteriorated beyond all hope. The officer's voice returned, harder now, stripped of the earlier attempts at negotiation. "You have 2 minutes to release our soldiers and surrender, or we attack regardless of casualties." Harrison shouted back, his mind racing through options that ranged from bad to catastrophic. "Your boys are unconscious but alive. They're going to stay that way if you let the Americans in the yard go free. You get your soldiers back. We get safe passage west. Otherwise, this gets messier than either of us wants." He heard the officer's harsh laugh even from inside the kitchen. The response came with finality. "You think I'm stupid? You are one man with kitchen knives. I have 40 soldiers with real weapons. Last chance, surrender now or we burn you out." Harrison did not respond immediately. He looked at Webb and Price, both young men with their lives ahead of them, both caught in a situation that should never have occurred. He thought about the 11 unconscious soldiers behind his counter, young men who had followed orders into a kitchen and encountered something outside their experience or training. He thought about the 40 Americans in the yard, men he had fed every day, whose lives hung on decisions being made in the next few seconds. And he thought about himself, 28 years old, a cook who had wanted only to serve his country and been told he was good enough to feed soldiers but not fight alongside them, a man who had spent 8 months proving his worth in a kitchen and was now about to prove it in a way no one had anticipated. Harrison made his decision. He raised his voice one final time, "Then come in and get your boys, I'll wait right here." What happened next defied all of Harrison's expectations and demonstrated something about the officer's character that would change the entire trajectory of the situation. Instead of ordering the assault that Harrison had accepted as inevitable, the officer called for a temporary ceasefire. His voice, still speaking accented English, requested to speak directly with whoever was commanding the American defenders. Harrison, recognizing that maintaining the fiction of multiple defenders gave him marginally more leverage than the truth, responded that he would come to the door to talk, but that any hostile action would result in immediate consequences for the soldiers being held. He walked to the kitchen door, his chef's knife visible in his hand, his appearance, blood on his face from the earlier cut, shirt torn and soaked with sweat, wild-eyed from adrenaline and exhaustion, exactly matching what one might expect from a desperate defender at the end of his resources. He stopped 3 meters from the door, far enough to retreat if needed, close enough to be seen clearly in the light spilling from inside the kitchen. The officer stood outside, flanked by 2 soldiers with weapons trained on the doorway. The officer was perhaps 40 years old, his face showing the weathering of extended service in harsh conditions. His uniform bore insignia that Harrison did not recognize, but that suggested significant rank. The officer studied Harrison for a long moment, his expression shifting through several stages: initial assessment, surprise, deeper calculation, and finally something that might have been respect. The officer spoke in careful English, each word pronounced with precision. "You are the cook." It was a statement, not a question, delivered with a tone that suggested the officer had already confirmed this fact from the captured Americans. But Harrison answered anyway. "Yes, sir, I am." "You did this alone, 11 of my soldiers." Harrison considered lying, but something in the officer's tone suggested that dishonesty would end the negotiation immediately. Whatever happened next would be built on truth or nothing at all. "I had help hiding the bodies. The fighting was just me." The officer's expression shifted again, this time settling into something Harrison could not quite interpret. The officer turned and gave a rapid order to one of his flanking soldiers. The soldier disappeared into the depot's central area, returning 2 minutes later with Lieutenant Morrison. Morrison looked terrified and confused in equal measure, clearly expecting to be executed or tortured. Instead, the officer gestured toward Harrison and asked Morrison a question in English. "This man, he is truly only a cook, not trained combat soldier." Morrison, bewildered by the question, confirmed that Harrison was assigned to the kitchen, that his military occupational specialty was cook, that he had no combat specialty or advanced training beyond basic infantry instruction completed 8 months prior. Morrison added, perhaps trying to be helpful, that Harrison was just a colored cook who had never shown any particular military aptitude. The officer listened to Morrison's assessment, then dismissed the American lieutenant with a wave of his hand. The officer's attention returned to Harrison, and now his expression was easier to read. It was respect mixed with something that might have been amusement at the absurdity of the situation. The officer spoke again, this time with a different quality in his voice. "In 2 years of fighting on 3 fronts, I have seen many brave things. I have seen men hold positions against impossible odds. I have seen soldiers fight when wounded, when exhausted, when all hope was gone. But I have never seen one man, with no training, using cooking tools, defeat 11 of my soldiers who have survived campaigns from North Africa to France." Harrison did not respond. He had no idea where this conversation was leading, but he sensed that the officer was working towards some decision that would determine whether the next minutes brought negotiation or violence. The officer continued, "You understand that tactically, I should destroy this building and accept the loss of my 11 men. The strategic value of this depot outweighs their individual lives. This is basic military calculation." "Yes, sir," Harrison acknowledged. "I understand that." "But there is another calculation," the officer said, "which concerns what kind of men we are, what kind of war we fight, what we choose to honor even in the midst of conflict. You fought with extraordinary courage, using inadequate weapons against superior force. This deserves acknowledgement." The officer paused, seeming to wrestle with his decision. Then he called out an order that brought medical personnel running toward the kitchen. He told Harrison to stand aside, to allow medics to attend to the unconscious soldiers, and assured Harrison that no further hostile action would be taken against the kitchen position during this medical intervention. Harrison, not entirely trusting this sudden shift, but recognizing he had no real alternative, complied. He stepped back as medics entered cautiously, found their 11 unconscious comrades, and began administering first aid. The medical personnel worked efficiently, checking vital signs, treating the burns from the scalding soup, bandaging the various head injuries. All 11 were confirmed alive, though several showed signs of severe concussions and other injuries that would require extended treatment. While the medical work proceeded, the officer engaged Harrison in conversation that seemed designed to satisfy the officer's own curiosity about how the situation had developed. He asked specific questions about the sequence of events, about which soldiers had entered when, about the techniques Harrison had used. Harrison answered honestly, describing the improvised tactics, the use of environmental advantages, the desperate gambles that had somehow succeeded. The officer listened with the attention of someone analyzing a tactical problem, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When Harrison finished his account, the officer was silent for several seconds before speaking. "What you did should not have been possible," the officer said finally. "My soldiers are experienced, well-trained, properly equipped. You are a cook with kitchen implements. By all reasonable military assessment, you should have been overcome within minutes. That you were not suggests either extraordinary luck or extraordinary capability. I believe it is the latter." Harrison did not know how to respond to this assessment, so he remained silent. The officer made his decision. He ordered his troops to release the American prisoners with sufficient supplies and 2 trucks to reach Allied lines safely. He explained to Morrison, in English, that this exchange was being made in recognition of extraordinary courage demonstrated by your cook, and that the officer wished it known that such valor deserved acknowledgement even between enemies. Morrison, still terrified and confused, asked why the force was not simply taking everyone prisoner or completing the attack that had captured the depot. The officer's response would remain fixed in Harrison's memory for the rest of his life. "Because in 2 years of fighting on 3 fronts, I have never seen one man accomplish what that man did. This will be remembered, and I choose to remember it with honor, rather than senseless killing of brave men who have already proven their worth. Now go, before I reconsider this decision or before my superiors arrive and make it for me." The American personnel, including Harrison's entire kitchen crew, were loaded onto 2 trucks under careful supervision. The trucks were fueled and supplied with enough provisions to reach Allied lines approximately 12 kilometers west. As the trucks prepared to depart, the officer approached Harrison one final time. "What is your name?" the officer asked. "Corporal James Harrison, sir, 523rd Quartermaster Service Company." The officer nodded. "I am Captain Friedrich Weber, 5th Armored Division. I will remember your name, Corporal Harrison. I suggest you remember this night not as a victory. You were simply less defeated than you might have been. But remember that courage exists in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by men armed with nothing but conviction and whatever tools are at hand." Harrison saluted, an automatic gesture drilled into him during basic training. Weber returned the salute with crisp precision, then stepped back as the trucks pulled away into the freezing November night. As the vehicles moved west through the forest, Harrison looked back at the depot that had been his home for 2 months, now occupied by forces that had demonstrated both military proficiency and unexpected honor. The officer stood watching the trucks depart, a figure silhouetted against the light from the kitchen, where 11 of his soldiers had learned that assumptions about cooks and combat capabilities could prove catastrophically wrong. The trucks carrying the released Americans reached friendly lines at 0200 hours on November 16th. Harrison's first action upon arrival was to vomit behind a supply truck, the accumulated stress and adrenaline finally overwhelming his system now that the immediate danger had passed. His second action was to file a detailed report with a major from Division Intelligence who initially refused to believe any of it until Morrison and a dozen other witnesses corroborated every detail. Within 48 hours, Harrison's account had reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Within a week, it had been classified, then partially declassified, then became the subject of intense debate about whether to publicize or suppress the story. The debate centered not on whether the events had occurred, too many witnesses confirmed the basic facts, but on what those events meant in the context of Army policy regarding black soldiers and combat roles. Harrison was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, in a ceremony conducted quietly in late November 1944. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism in action, displaying initiative, courage, and tactical brilliance far beyond his assigned duties or training, resulting in the temporary incapacitation of 11 enemy combatants and contributing to the safe return of 40 Allied personnel to friendly lines." What the citation did not mention, but what Harrison knew with absolute certainty, was that his actions had been driven less by tactical brilliance and more by accumulated frustration, desperate circumstances, and a refusal to accept the limitations others had placed on him. Harrison returned to kitchen duty after 3 days of medical observation. The Army made no move to transfer him to a combat unit or change his MOS despite the Distinguished Service Cross. He served out the remainder of the war cooking meals for service companies, and if he felt any bitterness about this, he kept it to himself. After the war, Harrison used his saved military pay to open Harrison's Kitchen in Memphis. The restaurant became successful, known for precision in food preparation and for the proprietor who rarely discussed his military service, except with veterans who recognized his name from the story that had circulated through Army units in late 1944. In 1977, a military historian located Harrison and requested an interview. Harrison, then 61, discussed the incident in detail for the first time since his military debriefing. The interview lasted 4 hours and covered not just the events, but Harrison's broader experience in a segregated army. Harrison passed away in 1989 at 73. His obituary mentioned his Distinguished Service Cross, but provided no details about how it was earned. His restaurant had closed 2 years earlier, the building eventually demolished for commercial development. The kitchen utensils Harrison used in his battle were not preserved. They remained in that Belgian depot, presumably lost when the depot changed hands multiple times during the subsequent weeks of combat. No marker exists at the site. What remains is the story itself, documented in military records and passed down through families. It serves as testament to truths that transcend the specific events, that courage manifests in unexpected places through unexpected people armed with unexpected tools, that systems of limitation will always be undermined by individuals who refuse to accept those limitations, and that even in war's absolute divisions, moments of recognition can occur between enemies who acknowledge each other's valor. Harrison himself offered perhaps the most accurate summary in that interview. "I want them to understand that I didn't become a warrior that night. I already was one. I just finally got the chance to prove it, and I used what I had. Every man in that segregated army who cooked or cleaned or drove trucks, we were all capable of more than they let us do. Some of us got to prove it. Most didn't. But the capability was always there, waiting for someone to stop telling us what we couldn't do." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.